thank you for joining us this evening for this very important planning process, for two very important planning processes. We appreciate your participation and engagement. By the show of hands, how many of you attended the first community meeting in July? Great. Thank you for coming back. And those who weren't able to make that meeting, that information is available on the website, bonanzapark.com. And we'll have an opportunity this evening to discuss some of the results that we heard from the community through that first phase. Where we are this evening, community meeting 2 out of 3. We will have another community meeting likely early next year. And if I can get the slide to change, thank you. So as an overview, we have the Bonanza Park neighborhood, which is the geographic core of Park City. A lot of us pass through this neighborhood or spend time in the neighborhood, live in the neighborhood. And this area, shown in blue, includes shows the 200 acres. And so we know that several properties within this neighborhood will be redeveloped in the coming years. And this is a really important opportunity for the community to come together and envision opportunities to improve some of the challenges that are in the neighborhood, and also to build on a lot of the things in the neighborhood that the community really has identified as a place for locals. And then we also have the 5-acre site for the feasibility study to envision what the future development uses of that site may become. So throughout this process, we have 4 incredible consultants. We have MKSK. They are a landscape and land use planning firm. We have development strategies to help with the financial realities of what the future of this neighborhood can look like. Fair and Peers with the transportation elements, and then we also have Future IQ, who many community members remember from the Vision 2020 process, helping with the community engagement. So our consultants will be introducing themselves this evening throughout the presentation. And you can see on the next slide that the consultants come from all over the country, but we also have local participants as well. And I will turn it over to David with Future IQ.
Okay, thank you, Rebecca. Good evening, everybody. Isn't it good to be here to have a conversation about the community? Aren't community planning sessions in Park City so much fun, right? You laugh, right? Well, actually, I think they are, right? And of course, the topic for tonight, which is part of this planning process for the Bonanza Park, is actually incredibly important to the future of Park City. And if you think about it, it is an area of land that is the confluence of so much. You know, there's so much goes into that. I mean, it's the arterial routes through the city, and you know, it joins the school, it's where a lot of the amenities are. So the decisions that get made about the future development and trajectory of that area are going to have long-term consequences. Now, we've been engaged in some of the community planning process, right? We've been asking you through the first phase what you'd like to see there. Of course, you know, that's kind of a bit of a wish list. Tonight, we have a different kind of a task at hand. So we want to understand what you've been saying, what your thoughts are about the future. But tonight's really about starting to dig into trade-offs. You know, because it's kind of easy to say, well, I want everything I want and I want it for nothing, right? Well, that's not quite as simple as that in the real world, right? So part of what we've been developing between the last engagement session and now is a series of analysis around options. So we're going to present a lot of information to you tonight, and it's going to be kind of a fair bit to deal with, right? So the format is, we're going to be in here for about 30 to 40 minutes. We're going to present a lot of stuff to you. You'll probably have a lot of questions and a lot of thoughts, and we've got the auditorium at the back is set up, or in the room across in the public room over there. We've got a whole bunch of kind of things you can interact with, right? So we'll be at tables, you can come and ask questions, you can have your say about certain things. So I'm not going to take questions in here. We're going to maximise the chance for you to be able to work directly in input next door and be able to probe the options and so on, right? Now, there's a lot we're going to go through, right? So there's a sort of a narrative, right? So we're going to start with the big picture of what you've said is your vision for the future of the Bonanza Park area. We're going to walk through what some of the scenarios and options might be for the 200 acres that makes up Bonanza Park. And then we're going to walk through what options might look like for the 5 acre area that the city owns, right? So we're going to sort of go through that cascade, and then we're going to go and get you to weigh in on things next door. And there's going to be quite dense information. You know, a lot of stuff about what do things cost? You know, what's the trade-off? You know, if we want activity and excitement and businesses, what does that mean for density? What does that mean for foot traffic and so on, right? All sorts of interesting trade-offs to deal with. All right, so we're going to launch into this. Okay, so in the first round we did a lot of engagement. As we saw with your hands, a number of you participated in the committee meetings and I presume the survey and so on. Great to have so many people come back actually. I think the continuity is really important to be able to get a significant group of the community to track this through from the sort of ideation, the vision, through to understanding the complexity of choices, trade-offs, and then into final decision. Okay. All right, so where we're at, we're going to start off talking about the small area, so the Bonanza Park area lit large. Going to talk a little bit about the vision piece, and then we'll go into the other elements as we go through. The timeline, we're sort of like about middle point, right? So we've had these tasks where we've talked about background research, we had the input, we've got a great advisory panel, advisory group that's working on both the areas, we had the community visioning workshop, and now we're into this develop the plan components, and that's all about the options and scenarios. Can we go back one, please? Thanks. All right, so some of the things that we heard in the first round, engagement about what people would like to see. So this is sort of getting to the vision part, right? And it's really interesting because the narrative that came out in this work connects very closely to the Vision 2020 work. And so you can see this coming through in these storylines here. So people see Bonanza Park as the locals area. You know, it's kind of like the Main Street is the tourist area. This could potentially be a really strong locals area. A lot of people already use it for restaurants and amenities and so on. People talk about moving through the study area should be safer and more intuitive. We need more affordable and workforce housing. This could be a place that it could go. Some people think that Bonanza Park area, if you're going to have some density, this is the kind of place to have it. The Kimball Arts Centre is one of Bonanza Park's top assets, needs a permanent home. We should be thinking about infill. You can see the kind of topics that people have talked about. Of course, all that's great stuff, right? And part of our challenge tonight is to think about, okay, how does that translate into different options that get put in front of you? How do you react to those? Does it capture this essence? And does it look realistic? Can we go to the next one? All right, so let's talk about the vision statement. We've sort of been trying to work on this vision statement, drawing together two things. So one is, what is Bonanza Park today, and what's aspirationally in the future? Because there's a lot of things people like about it today, but there's also things that people want to see for the future. So next slide, please. And this is just a high-level statement trying to wrap it together. I'm going to talk about goals under this. But really this is how it's coming together. Bonanza Park is where Parkites gather to shop, dine and experience local culture. The local culture is really key. We've heard that a lot, that people want to really have this local emphasis. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. The Bonanza Park of tomorrow will build on this vibrancy to become a more connected, livable and inclusive community for current and future Parkites. So next one. And these are the goals. So if you look at all the input that we've had so far, in terms of your input at the first session and all the cards you filled out, the sticky notes and the surveys, if you boil it down, we come up with these 6 main themes. Now, part of what we're going to ask you tonight is to weigh in on the language, right? So this is all draft. What we're going to show you is ideas, it's drafts, no decisions have been made, but we're trying to narrow the lens a little bit. In fact, even today we've had some good suggestions about some of the language, but I want to show you what we've got here. So one, mixed use. So people really do talk a lot about having a mixed use area. So that kind of, I think, infers for people vibrancy, a lot of activity. Local institutions, enterprises, organisations, businesses, entrepreneurship. Local is a kind of an overlay theme on this whole future of Bonanza Park. User-friendly, that's talking a lot to how do you get around in that area. You know, people talk about the disconnected. You know, there's not sidewalks. It's not easy to park somewhere and get to where you want to go, or you get blocked off. We want to think in this planning process, how do we make this very intuitive and very user-friendly for people who are making this their core destination. Inclusive, expanding the availability of affordable and workforce housing units. Green, all of the work so far people have pointed to, they want to see public spaces. They want to see spaces for people in the community to come and do stuff. And I think like the dog park just here is one of the really good examples of a public space that is really well utilised and is highly appreciated by people in the community. I think there's the opportunity in Bonanza Park to have more of that. And cultural, this idea of weaving arts and culture into the community fabric. And I think that's sort of been a thread through a lot of it, is that people really want to celebrate local artists and culture and, you know, bring all that together and weave it into the fabric of what Bonanza Park becomes. So that's where we've got to, right? One of the sessions tonight up the top there, you'll get a chance to weigh in on that and add your thoughts about the language. But that's the context. Now we want to dive into some of the details. So remember, that's the vision. So we've got this sort of aspirational, lofty stuff up there. Now we want to talk about how do you start to translate that into real plans? What do they look like? What do they cost? What does it take to get there, okay? So we're going to walk you through this. So Louise.
Thank you, David. So like David mentioned, these are high-level opportunities, these are high-level directives, these are big vision statements and project goals. The context of the plan is to find tangible solutions to achieve these project goals and to realize this vision. The plan does so through two main components. We have a land use component and a transportation component. We look at them separately, but also we have to look at them together. The land use vision will help the transportation component work. The transportation component enables the land use to really function effectively. We'll go through the land use component first. Land use is related to pretty much every single of the project goals, but it's most related to the idea of a mixed use and an inclusive neighborhood. A neighborhood that is walkable, well-connected, that has uses that support that walkability, but also a neighborhood that is welcoming to different types of housing, both affordable, workforce, and market rate. A land use component starts by identifying the current challenges and the current opportunities in your existing land use patterns and your existing zoning. We understand that land use is more than just land on a map. It is, functional things on the ground. And a lot of the land that we'll be discussing is privately owned, except for some publicly owned land that you all are all very familiar with. Now, how do we guide land use decisions and guide land use growth for land that is not controlled by the city? We do so through regulatory tools, through incentives, and through a community-guided process, much like this one, that will help future zoning decisions. So, as part of this process, you all will help us envision future land use densities and characters for Bonanza Park that will then guide community decisions later on as development occurs, and help us guide strategies. One of the first steps in doing so is looking at your current land uses. If we look at the map of Bonanza Park, you see a lot of red on the map, which is commercial land uses. Most of the 200 acres, with the exception, of course, of the cemetery, the protected land, is commercial uses. These commercial uses vary. Some of them have commercial retail, some of them have hospitality, but a lot of them function with surface parking and commercial businesses feeding off of those. Some of these uses are actually what we consider underutilized uses, or uses that are not perhaps living to their most realized potential or could be improved. We see these through a a prevalence of large parking lots, especially surface parking lots, which we're noting here with P's on the map. You can see that those kind of spread out throughout the entirety of the district. And we also have some legacy industrial or light industrial uses that are, for instance, the public works facility right in the center of the geographical area here. And how that relates to zoning is a little bit different. You have your land uses, but then you also have the underlying zoning that guides how current growth is happening. As you can see, also again, a lot of red. The red is delineated what is called general commercial. So general commercial zoning is a zoning district that is reflective of the current land uses, but does allow for residential, especially residential multifamily, as a conditional use. So it's not by right, so if there's an application, there's some decision making there in order to allow that. However, there are some restrictions on growth currently. So if you wanted to say do mixed use, there are some restrictions, some regulatory restrictions that will prevent it from doing so in a particular way. For instance, there's some height restrictions. For most multifamily, that is a 35-foot height restriction, which ends up being about 3 stories. There is an exception, and it's for an affordable master plan development where that restriction goes up to 45 feet, which is for about 4 stories. We also have some legacy zoning, which is zoning that is perhaps not reflective of the current land uses. Those are light industrial zoning. Those are perhaps opportunities to update that. And as we think through the land use vision for Bonanza Park, we have to think through the regulatory tools that guide growth in the future, zoning being one of them. This plan is an opportunity to rethink some of the current zoning districts and make suggestions for some improvements in the future that will guide growth. So if our vision for Bonanza Park and your vision for Bonanza Park is one of mixed-use development, we have to ask ourselves, is our current zoning getting us there, or is it preventing us from getting to our vision for Bonanza Park? So to do that, we start by asking you all, what is your vision for the study area? What is your vision for Bonanza Park? We're asking first by asking to reflect on the goals, one of which is mixed use, inclusive, local. But then we also ask to on specific parcels of land and trying to gather what are the types of land uses, building heights, characters that you would like to see in these different types of portions of the study area. For that, when we go to the other room, you'll see maps that have 3 different types of properties. The first one is what we're calling key catalyst sites. So the key catalyst sites are sites that are expected to redevelop within the next the next 5 years. So these are sites much like the 5-acre parcel, which we'll talk later on in this presentation, which already has a planning process. There's properties that already have an active application, so like the property on Kearns and Park Ave. There's also properties that have things under construction, so like the Engine House affordable housing project. So these are things that are perhaps a little bit more set, but have the ability to influence their surroundings. So when we talk about influencing surroundings, we really want to talk about medium-term infill sites. So these are sites that are ripe for redevelopment within the next 5 to 10 years. These are directly adjacent to those key catalyst sites or in very prominent locations. So when we go to the other room, we really want to ask you all, what if understanding that certain things develop, like the 5-acre site or things that are already with active applications, how do we want those surroundings to be influenced? What is the type of land uses, the types of building heights, the types of densities that we as a community would like to see there? In addition to that, we have the sites here in yellow. So we're calling these long-term infill sites. These are sites that may redevelop in the next 10 to 20 years. This is much more long-term visioning, and these are things that might take a little bit more time because the current land uses are hard to relocate, or things that are in an ownership that might prevent a sort of redevelopment. We still want to understand a land use vision for these, and we still will want to ask you, what are the right types of densities, the right types of uses. As we talk about density, you'll see some materials on the board, but we also want to understand what that means to you. Density is not necessarily just building height. Density is reflective of how much parking you allow or you want on a site. It's reflective of the character of whether you want that closer to the street, whether you want mixed use that has an active ground level, or whether you want a ground level use that's just residential. All of these things that when they come together, when you put in the metrics like dwelling units per acre, impact the density. Today, when we go to the other room, we really want to get into how you envision density and heights, which is something that in our initial phase of engagement was resulted as something that the community supported. What does that look like when we actually zoom into the study area and go into specific sites? Together with density, we want to talk about connectivity. These things cannot be talked one without the other. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, the vision for connectivity enables some of that density and that character to happen. And those land uses really work together with what we're thinking is a more connected study area. As we think through connectivity, we'll have a separate connectivity component as part of this plan. It will have a lot of information and data and analysis. But ultimately, the purpose of the connectivity component is to establish a network of streets for all users. So streets that not necessarily prioritize cars and high speeds, but also think about the experience of walking, of cycling, and of taking transit. Also, we want to emphasize safety. Safety is something that we heard in our initial phase of engagement. People said that the study area might not feel safe and welcoming for people to walk or bike. And we also want to think through bike connections, and especially those with the study area. As we think through Bonanza Park, one of the first things that we asked you all was if you were satisfied with the study area, rated from 1 out of 10. Overwhelmingly, a lot of you all told us that it was about a 3, maybe a 3.5. Not a great level of satisfaction. When we go into the results, a lot of those things had to do with connectivity. A lot of you said that it was just really hard to get through the study area, regardless of mode that you're traveling in. So as we think through what are the things that are getting in the way of that connectivity, it's a little bit of everything. So the blue arrow is starting to illustrate here that there's a lack of north-south street connections. There's some east-west connections, but if you want to move your way north-south through the study area through Bonanza Park, you really are forced to go into Kearns Park and Bonanza. That puts a lot of traffic and stress on those intersections and on those major streets. In addition, you have the fantastic asset of having the rail trail with seamless connectivity going through on the perimeter of the study area south toward Old Town. But you also have a fantastic trail system along Snow Creek Drive going up to the barn. If you're moving from the rail trail to the Snow Creek area, it is incredibly challenging to go from one portion of that study area to the other. There's a lot of decision making and a lot of instances where you feel unsafe. So there's a great opportunity to make these connections. When we talk about connections, we're not necessarily talking about a street or a street with only cars in mind. We're thinking of a menu of options. In our menu, there's a lot of things that will come into consideration. We're at a stage where we're really proposing or showing alignments for discussion and for consideration, but we're not necessarily set on what that alignment will look like. That's something that we really want your input. When we talk about alignments or street connections, we really talk about, a different type of thing. So we're talking about maybe some neighborhood streets, like a 2-lane road with a sidewalk. Maybe an alley or service drive that can be, it kind of, I as a biker like alleys because it's an easy way to bike through an area without necessarily having to be on a busy road. We also can talk about retail streets, the streets that are really amenitized for businesses and local businesses. Or we can talk about a shared street, or as the Dutch call it, a boener, which prioritizes pedestrians but allows cars to go through. We also talk about trail connection. So a trail connection, much like a rail trail, which is a fantastic asset. We can talk about on-street bike infrastructure, or even pedestrian ways and linear greens that cut through the study area but only allow pedestrian or trail access and are separated from, let's say, your sidewalks or from your street network. As we go into the next room, you'll see in the connectivity section of the connectivity section of the engagement, we'll have 3 different alternatives, each with different alignment. There's pros and cons and things that we'll want you to really think through with us and help us identify. So the 3 connections have, if you see here some lines in orange and in green, the lines in orange will start talking about alignments for future road connections or future street connections. These will starting to help alleviate some of the issues that we're seeing in the study area. But we're also suggesting some lines in green, which are some rail trail or pedestrian and bike connectivity connections. So these are connections specifically designed to connect the rail trail to the Snow Creek area. There are 3 different alternatives that we'll want your input on. The first one is we're calling the north-south connector, so it really focuses on creating this new south connection between Kearns and Iron Horse Drive. Then there's a realignment of Homestake Road. This one will get us a true north-south connection to a potential signalized intersection on Kearns. It's a lot more functional, but requires perhaps a little bit more realignment of some existing infrastructure. And the third one we're calling maximize the grid. And that's really thinking through future development and trying to find the most future street or pedestrian connections through the neighborhood to get you a very walkable and compact grid. All of these have different implications and pros and cons. Some will be more expensive, some will be a little bit more feasible in the short term. We really want to think through all of these with you all and start talking about them. So this is the section for the small area plan. We really want to get now to a separate planning process, which is the 5-acre site feasibility study. So the 5-acre site focuses on the property at the intersection of Kearns and Bonanza. It is very close to 5 acres, and it is city-owned. We've gone through a lot of engagement for this particular property throughout the last few months. We are also in the about midpoint through this process, closer to what David was saying earlier. We're in the second phase of engagement, so we are in a point in the process where we'll be presenting some economic data and some economic realities, but we're also going to be presenting some alternatives for how things can fit on the site. I would like to mention that all of these things are draft ideas, and we're really presenting them to you all for discussion. So these are things that are still waiting to be refined and developed. They're not site plans. These are not things that we expect to go tomorrow and start taking them out and building stuff. These are really, this is an interim point in the process where we're doing a check with you all to continue to refine this into a preferred scenario in the next 4 months. We've done, like I said, a ton of great engagement. We've gotten so many ideas. You've done over 1,000 Parkite voices engaged in this process just for this particular portion of the process. We've heard so many great things, and a lot of the great things about the site is just the sheer amount of opportunity that's envisioned for the 5-acre site. The fact that people just see so much potential. There's a lot of community support for a mixed-use redevelopment of that site that includes arts and culture uses. That development also should include housing to leverage that potential, especially affordable or workforce housing. People talked about the fact that this is only 5 acres. We went on a site tour today, and every time I go to the site, I'm reminded this is not that big of a site. There's only so much land, and there's so much opportunity, but there's also some restraints, and Andy will go a little bit into those constraints later. But people also told us that there's a lot of support for things like a permanent home for the Kimball Arts Center, a redevelopment that includes open space, and especially as a meaningful design element, and to make sure that this becomes a central gathering space for the community. One of the things that people told us is that they also want this project to be a real feasible site, a site that can actually, a proposal that can actually work and work with market reality. So for that, I'm going to pass it on to Matt with Development Strategies, who will talk a little bit about these economic realities shaping our concepts.
Thank you, Luis. Great to see everybody tonight. I was here the first public meeting, and just wonderful input from you all. Luis just reported on a lot of that, and I got to talk to a lot of you individually. A lot of you came up and said, I'm really interested to hear about the economics of this and whether this is economically viable. We're glad this is part of this project. So here we are. We're at a point in time where we've taken some of your feedback. We've put together some high-level scenarios, and we're going to be talking to you out there about it and getting your feedback on this. And so last time around we did some market analysis. We collected a lot of data so we'd have a solid foundation for our analysis. And now we're in this phase where we're doing market strategy, which is really about looking at different combinations of different kinds of uses and different ways that you can assemble different land uses on a site. And then we're looking at development feasibility. And what is development feasibility? Next slide, please. This is the simplest way I can explain it. So every project takes a certain amount of money to develop, right? It takes a certain amount of building materials and construction costs and so on. And then depending on what the use is, residential, retail, hospitality, there's a certain amount of revenue that it derives, and that creates a certain value. And if that value is equal to or greater than the cost that it takes to build something, you've got a feasible project. And if it's not, you have a gap. And what we mean by a gap is we mean there's some amount of money that if someone doesn't come up with that amount of money, the project doesn't happen. So it doesn't mean that it's impossible. What it means is, in most cases, there's a need for a public-private partnership or an institution or a foundation to come in and bridge that gap. So we're going to be talking about this a lot. And here are a lot of the inputs that go, a lot of the inputs that went into this. So there's a lot of math that goes involved, that goes into this, and we're going to spare you all from that, but just rest assured, there's lots of spreadsheets that go into this, looking at construction costs and land costs and a variety of things, environmental remediation, utilities, that all goes into this consideration. And so what I want to focus on now is ways that we can think about different uses that occur here. So, next slide. And here's a way to think about it. Think about it in these terms. There are some uses that are value creators, there are some uses that capture value, and there are some uses or things that are a public benefit. So put all the numbers aside for a second and just think about these three things. So value creators, these are things, we think of these as anchors. These are things that maybe they serve local people, but they also bring in people from a farther distance, right? They don't necessarily generate a lot of economic activity, but they bring people in. Then there are things that capture value, right? So these are things like market rate housing, like retail, like hotel. These are things where economic activity occurs, they generate revenue. These are the things that tend to pay for real estate development projects. And then there's public benefits, right? So that could be public space, it could be affordable housing, it could be affordable artist space. These are generally things that don't produce enough revenue to fully pay for the cost of a building. And so, and then there are things that kind of fall in between, like local business, local shops and dining. They generate some revenue, often not enough to build like a really expensive building, but they can be a really important contributor to a real estate project and certainly provide community benefit. So a lot of times what we do when we're looking at projects is trying to figure out and work with the community to find, okay, most communities love the public benefit, and we're trying to figure out what's the right mix of uses. And in particular, what are some of the things that capture value that you're most comfortable with so that we can start to put together a mix and a program that works for you and this community and this site. So this is, you could also think of it as this kind of sliding scale. And so we're going to have some activities and we're going to be asking you about these things, but you can kind of go from left to right and you can kind of see conceptually which things generate more revenue and which generate less, right? And you know, probably no surprise, right? Hotel, market rate housing, these retail generate a lot of revenue. And on the other side, affordable housing, affordable artist space, public space, these are things that cost money, and you can think about these things, right? Just like where I showed you on that diagram, right? Value capture, value creation, public benefit. Next slide, please. So what we did is we came up with 3 different programs. All right, and this is where, like at the breakout tables, we'll ask you to look at these things. So we've got something that almost is economically viable. There's a small gap because we've got some affordable housing involved, but we've also got a lot of like value generating real estate in that mix. And then we're going to work our way to something that has a little bit of a greater financial gap, right? We're introducing relatively more affordable housing. We're going to introduce affordable artist space. And then on the far side, we'll have something with a larger gap. And that we'll introduce even more affordable housing. So here's how this looks diagrammatically. These are buildings. Think about this as real estate program. Think about this almost like blocks of real estate, like blocks of Lego that have, you know, relatively different proportions of these things. So on the left-hand side, and this is what we're going to ask you to like talk about and comment about, right? There's a mix of market rate and affordable housing, there's some retail and dining, and there's a boutique hotel, and there's a very small gap, relatively speaking, about $10 million. Then there's the medium gap, okay? So we're introducing more affordable housing. Now we've got that affordable artist space. All right, so there's more money that we've got to come up with to help make this project work. And then on the far end, on the right, there's this large gap that you see, right? And so we've got a lot more affordable housing. There's no hotel or hospitality, just a little bit of market rate housing. Based on the feedback that you all gave us in the last meeting, we're looking at things more on the right-hand side, right? That medium gap to large gap it looks like what you all told us you want to see on this site. Next slide, please. And then, there's other ways we can think about this, right? What creates value, what captures value, next slide. And because we couldn't help ourselves, we also looked at a variety of other scenarios. Some that actually generate revenue, but don't involve things that you all told us you want to see on there. So there are things that are revenue positive that either involve more heights or land uses that you haven't asked us to put on this site. So it is possible. We want to share that just theoretically, right? And we also looked at the 2020 master plan, which had a lot of community aspirations. There weren't a lot of things that generated revenue, so that created a really large financial gap. Next slide, please. So this is how we can think about it. We can kind of take it back up a level, and this is what we all want to talk to you about. We can look at these different mixes of things, right? So number one, think about something with a lot of public benefit, a little bit of value capture, a little bit of value creation, kind of a smaller gap, and then we can, item two, right? A lot of public benefit, some value creation, some anchors that bring people in, but not much that creates economic activity that helps us pay for these things. And then there's item three, where you have a lot of value capture, but maybe not a lot of public benefit. And so these are the trade-offs. You heard David talk about trade-offs. This is what we mean by all of this. Next slide, please. And so one other thing we want to share with you is this isn't the only way that we can think about this. So there's a way to think about this where we have to look at this one site and there's a real estate project and we have to have enough revenue generating things that pay for these public benefits and things that don't generate quite enough revenue. Or we can take a district strategy and a district approach, okay? So we can look at the whole Bonanza area and say, if there are other areas in this district that you all as a community are more comfortable with in having some of these value creating and value capturing uses, we can work with that. That might imply a little different strategy, but that's another approach we could take. If what you want is a lot of public benefit on this particular 5-acre site, if there's another place where we can have the value capturing uses, we can create an economic strategy. We can use different economic tools and create a district and figure out some ways to pay for some of these uses and bridge the financial gap that way, all right? So think about a 5-acre site, you go up, you build, revenue generating uses to help balance some of the public benefit, or we can go out and look a little more broadly at a real estate strategy. And so there's going to be another table where we're going to be asking you about that, like, are there other areas in this district where you're more comfortable with some of these uses? And so lastly, the top line, we can think about, different uses that generate revenue, that help pay for other benefits, maybe a different mix of uses where maybe you have a little bit of each, right? Some public benefits, some things that generate revenue. And of course, at some point you get so much public benefit and so little revenue generation that there's a really big financial gap. On the bottom, the other concept to really think about is there's a site strategy where we look at this site as kind of a real estate project and we need to break even, have some revenue generating things to pay for these other things. We can take that district approach, right? Which is a little different, right? We can use economic development tools as long as we're adding some revenue generating and value capturing uses somewhere in a district, we can come up with a strategy to work with that. And then the third strategy is more of a citywide strategy, usually the least popular. In fact, if this is the strategy you all want to take, you'll be the first community that's chosen this in the 20 years I've been doing this, but that's one where it's a citywide strategy. And so you all collectively come up with the money to pay for this. Those are three different approaches that you can take. And so we're really eager to hear from you all on that. And so I'll be at one of the tables. We'll have another table talking about the district strategy. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andy Knight.
right. Andy Knight with MKSK. Glad to be here. Again, good to see you all today. So remember back a few slides when Matt was sharing the small, medium, and large gap scenarios. What we've developed here are some capacity studies. So these aren't necessarily proposals for development. They aren't necessarily site plans. But what we wanted to do was take those bar graphs and start to position them on the site to think about how could these lay out? How could you think about these in terms of creating place, potentially? Because there's not just buildings that are there. We're also thinking about open space. We're thinking about access and connectivity. And so we need to kind of think about a little bit more about the placemaking, in addition to not just the building space and the revenue generation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share a couple things just focusing in on the site. So instead of the district strategy, we're looking straight at the site in this particular scenario. But what we want to do is start to think about the site constraints and the existing conditions in the current zoning. So currently right now we have setbacks. We have a frontage protection zone, which is basically a 30-foot setback from Kearns Boulevard. We also have a 20-foot setback from Bonanza. So all of those begin to sort of dictate how close the development can get to the edge of the street. We also have, as Luis had mentioned, general commercial, which has restrictions on height. So those are things that we want to consider as well in terms of future development. We also have a utility transmission line, and it's very prominent on the site. And who was on the sidewalk today with us? Yeah, you guys got a good explanation of some of the anticipation of the potential relocation of that, which is going to unlock a lot, because right now it's very restrictive in terms of its development potential. But we're working with quite a bit here in terms of existing conditions, not only in just the zoning and the setback, but also the access to it. So those are things that as we begin testing those development scenarios and capacity studies on the site, we're trying to incorporate those as well. So what we have here are the small, medium, and large gap scenarios. Again, these are capacity studies. They do look a little bit like site plans. We are starting to test some ideas on here in terms of mixes of uses. So on the far left, which is the small gap, we're starting to show a 5-story building right now with commercial uses at the bottom, residential, mixture of market rate and affordable housing on the top. We're also showing the 5-story hotel up there in the corner. Again, this is a scenario to show if we're leaning towards a small gap, this is one way to start to think about that. We're also weaving in open spaces into this and better connectivity. So you start to see there that there's some green space. What we're showing here is about 3/4 of an acre of open space for gathering, community events. We're also showing a cut through here, the WUNF idea, if you will. It could be pedestrian space for events, you can close it off. It could also be during off times, access for the hotel or for the mixed-use building that's there. We're also showing above grade parking on this. Parking is something we have to consider. There's been discussion about some underground parking. What we're showing in this small gap is we're showing above grade, so that's about 4 stories of parking there as well, with a wrap around it. The medium gap is what we're showing is within the 4-story mix. We're showing mixtures of affordable and mixed housing, or market rate housing. So we're able to get to that 45-foot mark with that. We're also starting to show a few more of the things in bold, or the things that were strongly supported in the community engagement process. So we're starting to incorporate a few more of those within this. So we've got the affordable residential, local dining and retail. We've got artist studios, ground level art center, public space. So we're starting to incorporate some of that in there. In this particular one, art center would be at a ground level use in one of the larger buildings. And then on the large gap side, what we're starting to show is, again, opportunity for standalone art center and at the corner there, which is about 3/4 of an acre in space. We're showing community green space. We've got 4-story residential and a 4-story mixed-use building. Again, both of those, the medium and the large gap, also have parking structures associated with those. So what could this look like? we haven't really started thinking about the aesthetics or the character of the space yet, but we want to start to set the tone for what that could possibly look like. Just some ideas of, what could a pedestrian cut-through or space look like? What could outdoor gathering space, if you had a street that you could shut down and have it be flexible as a pedestrian space and a street as well? What could alleys look like, the one in the middle there? And then also thinking about density and how we stack mixed use. These two examples here have retail, commercial, dining at the ground floor with residential up above. Next slide. So next steps. We've thrown a ton of information at you all tonight, and we don't accept you all to have absorbed it all right now. What we want to do is have you all, invite you all to the back to have a conversation with each of us. We've got roughly, I don't know how many, 10, 12 different tables. So there's quite a bit of opportunity for everybody to kind of spread out and have a good conversation with us. Ask us questions. We've got plenty of opportunity for you all to provide feedback, provide preferences. And then moving forward after today, some of our next steps. So after today, what we're going to do is we're going to summarize the feedback that we've heard from you all. Also our advisory committees, we've got good feedback from them as well. We're going to summarize that, and we're going to start to prepare some of the preferred directions. We're also going to launch an online survey. I will note that this presentation will be uploaded to our website. David, what's the address for it? It's right there on the bottom, bonanzapark.com. We will upload this presentation to that, so please take a look. Provide feedback. There's online survey that will be there as well. Continue to represent your voice and the park guides. We'll begin developing preferred concepts based upon the feedback, so your feedback is extremely important tonight for us. And then we report back to City Council later in the process. So, thank you all again for coming. At this point in time, we invite you guys to come back to the interactive area. Love to talk to you.